Before we start today's session, today's our competitive session. We're going to be focusing on our four biggest competitors: GitHub, Azure DevOps, Jenkins, and Jira. And I'd like to just start off this session by asking, what would be a personal win for you in this next hour? So it's like, I just want to make sure that this presentation is as tailored as possible for y'all. What competitors would you personally like to learn more about out of those four?
Probably the most common one for me is probably GitHub versus GitLab. Yeah, I'd probably say.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah,
GitHub.
I mean, obviously Jira, Jenkins as well, but I mean, I think probably GitHub is the most relevant.
Yeah, I
Okay.
find with the Atlassian tools that it's I don't know, easier to convince them to come to GitLab and consolidate everything in one place. Where like GitHub, they have a harder time seeing the value of GitLab versus GitHub.
I think Azure is also hard because usually once they're on Azure, they're kind of a whole, they're fully baked into Microsoft, and then it's almost like going go screw yourself.
Johan, are you enterprise?
No, mid-market.
Okay. And Daniel, I think that you told me that you're mid-market too, or I don't remember in all honesty.
No, it's cool. I was in enterprise, but I'm now in SMB.
Okay, gotcha. All right, let's dive right in. So we'll talk about the four competitors with special emphasis on GitHub and Azure DevOps. So yeah, what's our agenda? Our agenda today is to win more competitive situations. So if, let's just say right now we're flipping 20% of opportunities, I want to see what I can do to make sure that that's maybe a 30 or 40%. These tools that we're talking about are ones that I have used for years. I used GitHub for about 7 years. I used Jenkins for about 5 years. I used Jira for 2 years. And I haven't used Azure DevOps, but I'm pretty familiar with it just because other people that I know and my friends have used it and I've talked to them about it. So we'll talk about like a little bit of the engineer's perspective on these tools. So if this is the goal, how are we going to do this? We actually, as a company, did some analysis on our win-loss record against these competitors. And then what we found is that out of the competitive cases versus, let's say, GitHub, if we were to lead with motions X, Y, and Z, then we had higher conversion rates. So there's actually one guy whose full-time job is to just like comb through all the Salesforce data, see which reasons why, what makes us more likely to win and what makes us less likely to win. And so we'll talk about what the data actually shows. The other thing that we'll talk about is we'll discuss our competitors and their value propositions. I did some inside snooping around and talked with Jenkins' past product manager and some of the people that used to be on their sales teams. So I got inside information on literally what they're saying to sell against us. Last thing is we got to talk about our differentiators. Which ones are the most important? Which ones, if we say X, Y, and Z, it really gets a customer to start thinking about their situation differently, and maybe that conversation opens up. So this is how we plan on winning more competitive situations. All right, so just to recap, we all know this, GitHub does a lot. Because of this, we have lots of competitors. That's one of the things that can be a little bit overwhelming when we start out here. But what we find out very quickly is that it's really four main ones that come up maybe 70, 80% of the time, right? And these ones are GitHub. This used to be my old laptop when I was at Red Hat. Azure DevOps, also owned by Microsoft. Jenkins, we'll talk about what CloudBees is in a bit, but CloudBees is basically the company that makes money off of Jenkins. And Atlassian, so Bitbucket, Jira, so on and so forth. These are our primary four competitors, and these are the ones that we're going to be targeting today. So I think that one of the challenges at GitLab is that almost all of our enablement's done by product technical marketing. And the problem with that is that we just hear the GitLab side of the story. And so when I came in here, one of the things that I really wanted to see is I understand that this is what we want our customers to believe, but what is the actual environment that we're in right now? Because it's important to understand this because this is what our customers are actually seeing, right? And so to take a look at this, what I did is I looked into a bunch of different metrics that are objective to basically see who are the dominant players and who are the challengers in each, like for different reasons. So one thing that I took a look at is like product capabilities. Obviously, we have 10 product categories. GitHub has 6, Jira has maybe around 4, and Azure DevOps has 7. So this is one of the things that we win by is just what we can do. But just like going in a little bit more, one of the things that I did is look at the number of job postings asked for each tool. So I looked how many jobs ask for GitHub, how many jobs ask for Jenkins. And this is a metric that can be used to tell industry demand for each tool, right? So this is what I found. And just for reference, this was in the United States. So the European numbers are similar, but they'll be different. So what I found is basically this. Out of the number of job postings in the United States, Jira and Jenkins are number 1 and number 2. They are by far more than everyone else. There are select reasons for this, but the number one takeaway here is that Jenkins is by far our most common competitor, and understanding how to flip Jenkins opportunities is one of the things that is really going to lead to more business just because there are so many of them out there. It is true that GitHub and Azure DevOps, we see them in our accounts. These are hard fought battles. Sometimes it feels like we can't even have a conversation if they're thinking about GitHub. But most of the market is actually around Jenkins right now. And Jenkins is actually one of the ones that we can target and target pretty successfully. So that's looking at careers. The reason why looking at careers is good is because careers tell us what is the market looking for in the next 1 to 2 years, right? So if we're hiring someone for Jenkins, we're probably going to use Jenkins for the foreseeable future. Let's take a look at some of the other metrics. So what I looked at number 2 is the size of Reddit communities. And the reason why is because developers love Reddit. Every single developer that I've ever talked to, they go on Reddit from time to time to go research tools and talk to other developers. It's just, for whatever reason, Reddit has become a tech community, especially for developers. And so I wanted to see how large is each of your Reddit communities, right? And this is what the data shows. The data shows that over here, that GitHub is by far the most popular on Reddit. And part of the reason why is because developers, they just love GitHub. And we'll take a little bit more of a dive into that. But the main point that I want to point out with this is that GitHub's by far in number 1. But all of a sudden, another story emerges. GitLab is all of a sudden number 2. Azure DevOps, Jenkins, and Jira, they're not that popular. And the reason why is because developers don't really care so much about them. They're not exciting, they're not new, they're not trendy. People don't want to engage and talk about it. We have spent and invested a lot into making a community that's powerful and robust. And even though these other competitors are much older than we are, we already have larger online communities than many of our competitors, which is a really great thing. Last thing that I want to talk about is third-party product ratings. So when we just get all of our information from product technical marketing, it seems like GitLab is by far the best choice, but what are our customers actually saying about us from a ratings perspective? So what Trust Radius is, this is a third-party website. They collect data and survey people. How much do you like Jenkins? Would you recommend it? A 4.5 out of 10, maybe a 5 out of 10, maybe an 8 out of 10. This is what it shows. So the data shows that GitHub is actually number 1 over all of the competitors. GitLab and Azure DevOps are around number 2. And then curiously enough, Jenkins and Jira, they are by far the least most popular. And so the 2 sources that we looked at here are Trust Radius and G2. They're basically just different rating sites. But the story emerges that GitHub is by far the most liked. And at the tail end is Jenkins and Jira. Was any of this data surprising to you?
I'm surprised how even it seems to be across the board. I thought there'd be probably some bigger discrepancies, but it all seems to be quite similar.
That's a good point.
Yeah, initially it showed kind of Jira and Jenkins having the upper hand in the first categories about implementation and the job roles, and then if you actually start looking a little bit deeper behind potentially what people are actually interested in, it's actually not that. So the conflicting bits of information is interesting.
I thought Jira would be a bit lower, or I guess, is this only just Jira? No, I guess not Atlassian as a whole, I guess then, right? These are just the
It's just
actual
Jira.
tools, Jenkins. Okay, then it's fine.
Yeah,
Because
it's
Bitbucket, I
not
know,
like,
gets a lot of trash.
yeah.
Okay.
Were you surprised to see any of the things that we showed, like job postings, besides just sort of like customer data?
Yeah, like why was Jira and Jenkins so popular for the job side of it, and then when you start sort of looking at it, people aren't interested. You know, why do you think that? Like then when you look at it, the community smaller. You know, there's not as many people that are interested about it, but when you go to jobs, it's a lot higher. Seems like a weird.
Yeah, that is a really, really, really insightful question. And there's actually a good answer for it. So I just want to circle a little bit back. Jira was made around 15, 20 years ago. Jenkins was also made around 15, 20 years ago. And so what ended up happening is that they were the first tools that really did, project management and automation with Jira. And so because of that, they just gobbled up market share. For about 5 years, they were the only tool that they could use. And so those people who are managers at that time used Jira, used Jenkins themselves, set it up. Now they moved on to become directors and senior directors, maybe VPs. And so they're the people that are in charge of making these job postings. And so they're asking for the same stuff that they used and are familiar with. That's why Jenkins and Jira is as high as it is in Career Builder. So that the story that emerges is that Jenkins and Jira, they're really old. Companies want them because people who are in these senior level positions, they use them and are familiar with them. But where the industry is actually going is GitLab and GitHub, because these are what the young developers actually want to use themselves.
Mm. Yeah, I get you. So people
Awesome.
think of like CI, and they just instantly think Jenkins just because that was one of the first kind of proper tools for it. Or, people talk about project management, they just instantly Jira will come to their head because it's one they used to use, sort of thing.
Yeah, and so that's why it's really important to tell our story to other people, is that a lot of people still don't really know what GitLab is, but once they understand it and the value proposition behind it, we can pretty easily take out Jenkins and a lot of the time.
Isn't a problem as well, or I'm wondering, I guess, the question in regards to, I guess, both Jira and Jenkins, in the sense where it's like, it's so heavily ingrained in the company. There's so much, backlog years of data on it. And I guess they assume migration is quite hard, that they kind of are just stuck with it, even though they don't necessarily like it.
That is the case with Jira. With Jenkins, I think that a lot of people would be really grateful to migrate to something that's easier. We'll talk about it a little bit more in the Jenkins section, but Jenkins is really, really, really hard to use. I had to administer my Jenkins environment for about 5 years, and then it broke literally probably like maybe once a week. And there's a lot of the reasons for it. So, yeah.
So I think actually at the beginning of the call, you asked me and Johan, what are the two that you'd like to go into more detail on? And I said GitHub and he said Azure DevOps. And I think actually it's interesting because if you look at now what we've discovered and the reason we said them, I think it's because like Jenkins and Jira are easier to flip to GitLab, which is why we care more about maybe looking at Azure DevOps and GitHub, because and this data kind of shows that people care less about it and they're older tools. Like there's been so many, I don't know you, Johan, but yeah, there's usually some kind of like frustration that I find. It's like, oh yeah, I really want to get off of Jenkins, and it'd be nice to have everything in GitLab, and oh yeah, I don't really like using Jira, and they're almost selling it to themselves, where the people that I speak to that are on like Azure DevOps or GitHub, it's really it's more of a fight, which is why I want to understand more about how we can flip those ones.
I think that Jenkins is our biggest market opportunity. My personal opinion of this is that Jenkins will probably dramatically decrease in usage over the next 5 to 10 years. So in Jenkins' stead is probably going to be a number of different tools that are going to take its market share. And if we position ourselves to be one of those to take up this huge chunk, then that'd be a really great opportunity for us. I think that this is why so like our marketing campaign, Jenkins campaign number 3 that we just kicked off, that's why we're spending so much resources and time into this. All right, awesome. So let's talk about some of the findings, right? In the developer community, GitHub is by far the incumbent. They have over 42 million registered users over 200 different countries. So they are by far the most popular among developers. I used to be a developer. I loved using GitHub. It was the reason why is because GitHub is the things that they do, while it's limited, they do really, really, really well. And it's just like very elegant and beautiful website. So that's part of the reason why GitHub has as much traction as it does within developers. In project management, so what we mean by that is like issues, milestones, roadmaps, stuff like that. Jira is the incumbent. Just fast forwarding a little bit, Jira has an estimated around 53% of the entire project management market. So within that one product category, they're the dominant player by far. And in product ratings, we already took a look, but GitHub's number 1, GitLab and Azure DevOps are tied for number 2. So diving right, yeah, go ahead.
Just a super quick question. On that Jira being 53% of the market or estimated, do you know what the second one is? Like, is it close between like Jira's got 53 and then whatever the company is before that is like 30, 40%, and then there's just a load of little companies, or is it literally like Jira and then just loads of little companies that probably have about 5% each sort of thing? Do you know if it's like that or?
If I had to guess, number 2 is probably Trello. And the funny thing is that Atlassian actually bought Trello, so they would own then number 1 and number 2 if I'm right about that. But Trello is also pretty popular. After that, I think it's a steep dive off. I don't foresee anyone having more than 10% market share outside of those 2 tools.
Right. Yeah. So it is pretty just like dominant with Jira.
Yeah. All right. So diving into GitHub, this is one that we see in our accounts all the time. So it's the biggest threat to GitLab, and management knows this. The good news with this is that our management is really smart, and they've taken a lot of steps to basically have a really thought out battle plan with Microsoft. And so let's just talk about a little bit more about them. So they have a huge number of users that really like the product. I used to be one of these users. And let's just give some metrics. There's this thing called the Alexa ranking. It's basically how much web traffic that you get among all websites in the entire planet. And out of this global rankings, when I checked, GitHub's Alexa ranking was number 86 globally. So they're top 100. GitLab in retrospect is number 2,614. So we shouldn't be intimidated by this, but we do need to respect it. What we're looking for right now is year-over-year growth, and we're growing around 70 to 80% year-over-year. So we are catching up quickly, but we do need to understand that they have a lot of adoption. And another part of the reason why is there's a huge number of open source communities that live on GitHub. They were very smart in doing this. And the reason why is because if you have open source on GitHub, well, open source are the most vocal advocates in your community. They're your community leaders, right? And so if all the community leaders in technology are using GitHub, they like GitHub, well, they now go off and become VPs of other companies and things like that and lead engineers, and they're huge advocates for the platform. A little bit more about its history. They were acquired by Microsoft in 2018 for 25 times revenue. So we're talking about around $8 billion. So a huge astronomical amount of money, one of the most expensive from a revenue multiplier acquisitions in all of tech history. Let's talk a little bit about what some of the things that we just talked about. And the story that I'm trying to show here is just sort of like, if you think about like a traditional business, if I have a bunch of signs around my town, then that's going to increase the amount of traffic for my business, right? And in the new like e-commerce world that we live in, if a lot of websites and different places all around our ecosystem talk about one thing, it's basically like a billboard for that tool, right? And so one of the things I want to talk about is literally all over the developer community and websites. This one website is one of the most popular websites for Python. What you can see over here under the project links is it's a link to GitHub, right? So it's just, they're very, very, very visible. There's all sorts of websites that link to their platform. And all of this means that they have huge, just like they're very, very visible. In terms of developer resumes, I've probably looked over several hundred developer resumes in my life when I was interviewing people. And I'd say over 2/3 of them included people's links to their GitHub address. And the reason why is because developers usually, they post their GitHub username because that's their resume. If I wanted to go see how good a developer is, I would look at what they're doing on GitHub, the code they're committing, and then I would use that to determine if I wanted to hire someone or not. So all that story is to show is that they have lots of adoption. They're very visible on the internet. Another thing is that they're problematic for enterprise. Y'all are both commercial and SMB, so this doesn't affect y'all as much. But if you're like a Fortune 500 or Fortune 100 company, a lot of the time you want to work with other established brands. Part of the reason why is because it could be for political reasoning. Another part of it is that it's just way simpler to talk to one vendor that offers 30 different things than to talk with all these small vendors that like do one thing and it may not exist in 2 years, right? So for these large businesses, a lot of the time they'll just buy like 20% of their entire IT spend from Microsoft, 10% from Google, so on and so forth. And then the other thing is that Microsoft already has pre-existing relationships with all enterprise companies simply because of Microsoft Office and Windows Server, right? So while we have to do a lot of work to get meetings, their salespeople already have regularly occurring meetings with C-level and VPs in these companies just because they're Microsoft. And what they do is actually, we've seen this in the last 6 to 12 months, but they're doing this thing called an enterprise agreement. And what that is the idea that like, let's just say that you have a $40 million renewal, right? They basically say, hey, I'm gonna go throw in GitHub for your entire developer team for free. And that's gonna be one of the things I'm gonna throw into the deal. Well, if you're getting GitHub for free, then all of a sudden they've just locked us out of the account, right? So it can be really hard to overcome enterprise agreements. So we got to talk a little bit about what it does. And traditionally, when I use this, it only did 2 things. Once again, we do 10 things. Our biggest differentiator with GitHub is the fact that we do so much more than them. And the 2 things that they do is version control, so they hold their code, and issues. And so the story behind this is that Microsoft comes and they buy GitHub, right? They make an $8 billion investment. And then around 2018, 2019 timeframe, GitLab starts really getting a lot of traction. We're growing 80% year over year in sales. And then so they start getting a little bit defensive about GitHub. They realize that hey, if we don't do something, then we're going to lose money on this huge, massive financial investment that we just made. So all of a sudden, they started investing a lot more into GitHub to basically make sure that they had competitive differentiators with us. And so all that is to say is that they started increasing the number of features and capabilities that's offered with the product because of competition primarily from us. They've been copying our roadmap for a bit. Literally in this right hand image right over here, you can see that like the roadmaps are very, very, very similar. Whatever we put out, a lot of the times you'll see the exact same thing on the roadmap 9 months to 12 months later. And another thing is that from a technological perspective, my estimate is that they're about 1 year behind us, but they're making up ground quickly. Why? Because if Microsoft wants to put enough engineering talent into this thing, they have so much money, resources, capital, talent, then it is within their ability to do this. The big benefit for us is that Microsoft doesn't actually care that much about the DevOps space. What they are focused on winning is the cloud space. If they win the cloud space, that is going to be how they make sure that they are a dominant tech player for the next 50 years. DevOps for them is almost like a cherry on top. It's one thing that they care about, but it's not like the dominant thing that they're going after. So it is true that they could catch up ground quickly. They are focusing most of their attention from an engineering perspective against Amazon Cloud because that's how they make the most money, is in the public cloud space. All right, so let's just summarize. Microsoft makes a big financial investment. GitLab puts pressure on them. They start copying our roadmap. They're about 1 year behind us from a product perspective. GitLab's strategy right now is to basically grab as many accounts as it can while it has product advantages and to try to double down on our product advantages. That's why we're investing in security right now. All right, so let's have y'all ever seen GitHub itself? Would you like to see it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so let's dive right in. So this is the GitHub platform over here. Does this look pretty similar to GitLab? Yeah, it's almost the exact same thing, right? So it shows us our code. This is their SCM. It's very, very, very similar to GitLab. And then the other thing that I'd like to show is issues. So we've taken a look at GitLab issues before, but in GitHub, it's almost the exact same thing. So I
Wow, they
wrote
totally
this.
copied it. That's ridiculous. Sorry.
Yeah, they're very similar. I actually don't know who came up with issues first. They could have actually come up with them at the same time, but
You've even got your milestones on there as well, like on the right-hand side.
Besides coloring in the logo, you think you're on the same thing.
Yeah, it's crazy.
yeah, very, very, very similar. Have you all heard of GitHub Marketplace?
Nope.
All right, so this is something that's pretty important to understand. We have had large competitive, so let's just dive a little bit in. So they're very similar to GitLab. As you already said, it looks almost the exact same, right? And they have SCM and issues. We just literally looked at those two. But they've started putting all this other stuff in. So they have their own version of CI. They have some packaging stuff. They have some deployment and release functionality. It's not as good as ours, and the community understands it's not as good as ours. And a lot of developers actually know, the ones that are more aware of the environment, they know that they're just trying to copy us. So that's actually understood within the developer community. So what Microsoft did is actually strategically really interesting. So from their perspective, they come together, they have all their strategy analysts, and they say, well, we have this other competitor. It has features on us that we don't. It would take us a bunch of time to do this on our own. we have all of the open source community on our platform. So maybe what we can do is we can leverage the open source community to actually extend GitHub itself and catch up our product for us. So as opposed to Microsoft hiring a bunch of engineers and making GitHub better, what they did is they made the ability for the open source community to contribute back to GitHub itself and to catch up ground quickly. And since the vast majority of the open source community is on GitHub, they were pretty successful at this. So what they did is they made it extensible. They created this thing called GitHub Marketplace. And so what this is it's basically one portal in which other companies, open source contributors, anyone can just make basically, it's not a plugin, but it's pretty close to a plugin. Other people can extend GitHub functionality. Some of these things are paid and some of them are unpaid. And all of these extensions are called actions. So let's just actually take a look at this. So let's just use this as a reference. This is GitLab. This is all of the stuff that we can do. There's maybe 60 different things that we can do, right? So what they did is they created this thing called GitHub Marketplace, and they basically created this portal where any person in the open source community could make their own SAST or DAST or CI integration or thing that has to do with Docker. And now fast forward into the future, they have over 6,100 actions that are on this marketplace. All of this stuff is how they wanted to catch up with the stuff that we did. So just like as the review, for the longest time, GitHub only did 20% of this. They created actions, and now actions was their ability to do everything else. And now the community is actually the people who are supplying these actions. So some of these are by open source contributors, and some of these are actually by companies. So you can see this one's by Docker. This is by Google, right? This is by Atlassian. And so this is how someone would build out their CI pipeline using GitHub. They would go into the marketplace and get all sorts of different actions that correspond to what they want. I'll just give you a quick visual example of this. So this is like the GitLab CI. This is an image that we're pretty familiar with. We get all sorts of great stuff with GitLab, like code quality and linting and SAST and DAST. If we wanted that equivalent stuff in GitHub, we would go to the marketplace and then we would find equivalent stuff, and then that would be used for implementing our GitHub pipeline. So I know there's a lot of information. Can I help clarify anything that I've talked about so far?
I mean, one thing, Chris, isn't that also kind of how GitLab? Okay, two questions here. You mentioned community, the dev community. If they're so aware that they're being copied, wasn't there also kind of a big traction where the dev community was kind of like, let's say, annoyed or taken aback when Microsoft bought GitHub and almost by default boycotted them? I mean, enterprise, I understand. Obviously, it's very in-baked, like you said, in the kind of offerings. But isn't the general dev community still kind of, let's say, against the kind of giant David Goliath kind of mentality kind of thing, or?
Absolutely. So the developer community and the open source community, they would much rather prefer to work with small companies just because they themselves are small companies generally, right? If you're an open source company that's trying to make money off of your open source product, you're probably a small company. So a lot of people, they don't necessarily want to work with Microsoft because of that. But the problem is that when Microsoft bought GitHub, GitHub was already the dominant developer community. And then so they just bought the platform that everyone was using. If GitHub was Microsoft's platform 10 years ago, then there would have been more time for developers to not like it. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
What are some of the limitations that y'all see about actions? So if I have the benefit of GitLab, if one company has developed all 60 of these categories, tested them, made sure that everything works together, versus and makes it so that like everything's seamless, you don't have to integrate anything together, versus if you go into actions and all of a sudden your CI is made by 10 different companies, what are some of the problems that y'all see with that?
I mean, there's a clear problem, but I mean, Chris, I'm guessing like also Microsoft, I mean, besides of course, Docker and these bigger companies who are contributing here, I'm guessing their goal is just to kind of, either have these get more contributors, gain traction, either just directly copy them or buy them for, let's say, little money. I mean, I'm guessing Microsoft has a kind of a grander strategy here in regards to how to implement this into GitHub, but probably at some point, no?
Yeah. So GitHub doesn't mind if third-party vendors put their stuff on their marketplace. And the reason why is because if third-party vendors are extending GitHub, then their tool wins or people want GitHub. And some of these vendors, what their service costs money, right? So some of these are open source, is free, and some of these are by enterprise companies like Docker and Google, and they charge money. If I were to get some of these, I would have to pay additional money. And now GitHub or Microsoft would get a cut of whatever I'm paying for this app vendor.
It's pretty smart.
What happens if 10 different companies are supplying my CI pipeline? Like from a support perspective, do you think that'd be complicated?
Complicated and costly if you're paying for half of them.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just say that I built out my CI using GitHub Actions. With GitLab, everything's verified to work together. It works seamlessly together. If I have any problems, I only have to contact one company. But to get equivalent CI, there might need to be 40 different GitHub actions that corresponds with this thing that we have here in GitLab. And then so now I have 40 different vendors that I might potentially need to contact for support. So it's way more complicated to deal with 40 vendors than one. The other problem is the vast majority of the actions that are here are actually open source communities. So they're literally unsupported. No one supplies support for these actions at all. So one of the big problems with GitHub Actions, and take a look at my Google search results, right? Number one is Google Action security risk. And you can see all of these different links. Use GitHub Actions at your own risk. Number two is use GitHub Actions at your own risk. Number three is our GitHub Actions safety. Our number four is our GitHub Actions safety use. So it's a really big problem. Problem number one is a lot of these are open source projects. There's no one verifying their security. There's no one, they're unsupported. Problem number two is that just because there's so many different vendors all of a sudden, between like the integrations themselves, between GitHub and the action, the other company, all of that's an additional security risk. And so basically the idea is like, where does your data live, right? Your code is your most valuable asset. Part of the reason why people buy GitLab on-prem is because they need to really make sure that like no one can ever hack their code. But all of a sudden, look at all these companies that are potentially touching my code. Do all these companies, do they pass our security requirements, right? So GitHub is owned by Microsoft. Maybe they passed. But what about Calibre app? Are they secure? What about 42 Crunch? What about Tonic Code? And all of a sudden, if I were a large enterprise and I really wanted to build out my CI using GitHub Actions, I need to now verify the security of maybe 40 different vendors as opposed to one, which is a huge time constraint. and is ultimately like impossible to really do well.
Yeah, I think it's like a really smart move for them to kind of catch up on our roadmap without having to like invest a huge amount. Like they've been able to like leverage other people's work, and it's I think it's smart what they've done. But yeah, it obviously comes with its cons because there's no magic pill to fix
Yeah, absolutely. The last thing that I'd mention, and I already talked a little bit about this, is that most of these things, I don't want to say most, a lot of the things that are on the actions cost additional money. And so if I wanted to do this, I have to pay money, one, for GitHub, the platform, and two, now I have to pay Google money. I have to pay Amazon money. I have to pay Atlassian money. And then so my bill just increases in size too. So the three cons are, one, security. We don't know who, a lot of these are open source communities. No one's really secured them. Two, it's the same thing with integration hell, right? So if the more different tools that we have, the whole value prop of GitLab is that we have one tool that does all of this. This saves companies time, money, energy. They don't have to integrate everything together. If there's less integrations, then stuff breaks as less, right? And so you don't really get any of that, because if I have my CI, there's 40 companies that are involved. They're all stitched together. They all have their different support contracts. We have to verify all of them for security. That takes a lot of money. And just because there are now so many vendors, it's the same problem with integration hell, right? It just becomes really unwieldy and complicated to manage. So that's the ultimate big problem with GitHub Actions. It's a really good idea. It doesn't have that much traction in the business world simply because of these reasons. If you go and talk to developers, most developers don't want to use GitHub Actions. They would want to use something else simply because they know that like it's not mature yet. So
I'm not sure if I missed it, but when did you say this was launched, GitHub Actions, or when did they kind of like ramp it up, so to speak?
it was launched about, I'd say, around 2 years ago.
Okay.
Even though it was launched around 2 years ago, the vast majority of the developers that I talk to, they don't want to use GitHub Actions. And a matter of fact, it's almost like uncool right now. All right, awesome. All right, so GitHub Actions. All right, so summary of the strengths of Microsoft. They're backed by one of the most popular and successful tech companies in the world, which has vast financial and engineering resources. They already have pre-existing relationships with enterprise, so they don't have to fight for meetings. Their core offering is great, really highly reviewed, and it's really extensible with GitHub Marketplace and Actions. Because of how they built this, there are really big problems with it as well, which keep a lot of people off of GitHub Actions. So let's talk about how we went. What's the data show? So having taken a look at the Salesforce data, our team that analyzed all of our win-loss record, we found that we are most likely to win if we lead by the features that we have. The fact is that it is true that you could have more or different things with GitHub Actions, but if I were a business and I need to move quickly, I don't have time to evaluate GitHub and then 20 other app vendors for my CI, including their security and everything else. It's just sort of like, by the time I verified everything from a security and business perspective, like my competition's moved on. My ability to get GitLab and to know that everything works together and works well together is part of the value of GitLab. It saves me time and money just because the deal cycle is so much shorter, right? So our core offering is way better than GitHub's core offering. That's just a fact. And businesses understand this. So if we lead by the fact that we do more better, then that is the number one reason why we win. That's what the Salesforce data shows. Let's talk a little bit more about this. From a roadmap perspective, they're about 1 year behind us. But obviously, we're pushing out new things all the time. Our goal is to make sure that they are always behind us. Many of their new, go ahead.
So I was going to say, in terms of, I don't know if this is in a later slide, do you go over kind of like what our biggest weaknesses are as GitLab?
What GitLab's biggest weaknesses are?
Yeah, like where we fall short and how maybe competitors are flipping us the other way around so we can like counter that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that at the end.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
remind me if I don't bring it back up. Yeah, so how we win, we talk about the fact that we do more better. We are one tool for the entire DevOps lifecycle. You don't have to go into GitHub Marketplace and select all this stuff and to verify all this stuff, which ultimately costs you time and money and a huge evaluation cycle. And many of their new capabilities are half-baked, right? Because they're trying to develop things quickly. A lot of the new functions that they're putting out aren't good. And then number three is pretty much probably one of the biggest details for us to bring up, and our biggest differentiator with GitHub in general is the fact that with GitHub and enterprises in general, we have right now the best built-in security offering, and it is by far better than GitHub's. So GitHub is trying to build in additional functionality, but the whole idea of testing your applications for security during the dev process itself, we are the best tool in the market that does this right now. And so if you're ever on our product calls with Scott Williamson and even hear Sid talking about it, almost a huge chunk of our engineering investment is on making our security better because that is our primary differentiator from a technological perspective right now with GitHub. All right, so one more example of just how we do more from a features perspective is self-hosted deployments. On the bottom right, this is actual market share of self-hosted providers, and GitLab has around 80% of the market. GitHub only has 3%. We are way better than they are, and the market data shows this. Customers, if they really want to have a self-hosted deployment, they pick GitLab almost 90% of the time. We talked about why GitHub Actions has problems, and then the last thing is the fact that we're open source. This resonates if I'm ever talking with a company that has open source components, or they might be working on an open source project themselves, then it's a really great way to resonate with them, right? We're open source too. That means that you can be part of our community. You can influence our roadmap directly. You can just literally go on issues and then select, write what you want. That's really powerful for a lot of businesses, is to be able to feel like you are part of something larger than just a business agreement. I think that we've already seen this, but once again, just almost a visual of showing that like we do so much more than GitHub right now from a sheer product perspective. Can I help clarify anything about GitHub before we move on to Azure DevOps? All right, awesome. So let's talk about Azure DevOps. And the story behind Azure DevOps is kind of interesting. So fast forward into history, 2015, Microsoft creates this thing called Azure DevOps. And it's really kind of interesting because 3 years later, Microsoft acquired another company, GitHub, that does a very, very similar thing. So generally speaking, technology companies, they don't acquire two companies that they do almost identical things. They acquire one and then just put all of their eggs in that basket, right? So it was a strategic decision on Microsoft's part that kind of raised a bunch of eyebrows. And what the data actually shows is that GitHub is Microsoft's future bet. How we know this is that following their engineers on LinkedIn, we actually see Microsoft Azure DevOps engineers being moved over from working on Azure DevOps to GitHub itself. So Microsoft is shifting their focus from Azure DevOps onto GitHub. And the other thing that we see is that like a lot of the functionality that GitHub has been improving on and working on, it actually is Azure DevOps code, basically. It's basically just like copied and pasted in. Another thing is just talking about roadmap. GitHub's roadmap is way more robust than Azure DevOps is. So all that is to say, since they have two tools that do a very similar thing, Microsoft has chosen one to invest in. It's not going to just like get rid of Azure DevOps because it obviously wants renewals, right? But in the future, it's putting most of its emphasis onto GitHub. Why do you all think that is the case?
I mean, GitHub, like as you said, has the biggest community base, and obviously with Actions, they're still kind of making a big roadmap. So there's more traction, I guess. There's more traction in GitHub. I mean, Azure, I guess, as you said, is an older product. The ones who are currently using it are using it more because they've been based on it for a while. And I'm pretty sure by 2022 they'll probably start during renewals, just kind of say, hey, we'll offer you GitHub probably.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
when I was in enterprise, when I first joined GitLab before I went to SMB, Azure DevOps was one of the ones that had a few times where they said they're locked in for until the end of the contract or whatever, and it's a waste of this time even talking. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. From a technological perspective, they do more than GitHub does right now. And having talked with and done a bunch of I went on all their sales marketing sites and I looked around. It's actually really interesting. If you talk to one of the people from GitLab, we talk about we're one tool for the entire DevOps lifecycle. This saves you time, money, license cost. They say the exact same thing about their tool. It is literally almost an identical sales motion. They say we're one tool for the entire DevOps lifecycle. We are all that you need. You save time, money, and license cost. Also similar to us, they're deployed both in self-hosted and also as a SaaS. One thing that they do have that's an advantage over us is that if a company uses a bunch of Microsoft tools like Visual Code Studio, Microsoft Test Manager, things like that, Azure DevOps basically works better with Microsoft stuff than ours does. Ours is better for Kubernetes and Linux. But the good benefit for that is that the tech industry in general is going towards Kubernetes and Linux. So it's an advantage for us actually. So how do they compete against us? One thing that's kind of interesting is that there are actually separate sales teams between Azure DevOps and GitHub. And so sometimes they sort of I don't want to say fight each other, but they end up in the same account. Yeah, so one of the big differentiators with us is that they have more flexible pricing. So they can say hey, this is like a $15 million deal because we're working with the enterprise. And we can say, we'll have a tiered structure. Month 1 through 3 will be the evaluation phase. We'll give you 10% of your seats. And then month 3 through 6, it'll be your ramp up phase. We'll give you another 30% of your seats and we'll charge you for less. Finally, by year 1, we'll put you at full 80% capacity. And if you want more than that, then we'll give you a discounted price, something like that, because they're working with bigger deals. They also talk about literally we have all of these charts that say we do more than them. They have their own charts that say that they do more than us. So Git LFL supports large files. They say that both does this, but look at all the yeses in their column, and then they say a no in their column, right? Very similar sales motion. Their idea is that they're one tool for the entire DevOps lifecycle, and they're more mature than us. In actuality, we do more stuff than them, but there are areas in which they do more stuff than us.
So is that actually true then? That's not lies. The things they say that we can't do is true. They just obviously focus on those areas more.
I think that having looked at it, some of it's true and some of it's not true.
So in their sales tactics, they are actually just straight out lying about what we can do as a product.
I don't think that it's necessarily lying. I just think that it's selective emphasis.
Yeah, they're just framing it in a certain light to their advantage, which any company kind of does really. But yeah, I get you.
Yeah. If you go on even our documentation, people in the community challenge us on that stuff all the time. And sometimes we actually change it. The difference is that we'll change it. For them, a large enterprise company, they probably won't change it just because they don't have mechanisms to change it, even if they wanted to.
Right. Okay.
All right, so let's talk about how we win. We are the most complete solution for software engineering and DevOps right now. There are only involved in 6 out of 10 of our total GitLab categories. They'd say that it's more than 6, but really, from what I've looked at, it's only really 6 out of 10, especially for companies that are more involved in non-Microsoft stuff. So some companies in the enterprise space, they do not want to work with Microsoft simply because they've chosen Amazon as their vendor. And sometimes they're actually directly competing with Microsoft. In accounts like that, that's a huge GitLab opportunity just because they're never going to choose Microsoft because it's just like not within their business interest to give them money, right? So either from a business perspective or a technological perspective, if they don't like Microsoft or if they're not using Microsoft stuff, if they're using things like Linux, containers, and Microsoft and microservices, so Kubernetes, then we have a huge advantage over Microsoft. We can use open source again. We're kind of like position ourselves as we're a community movement. You're not just going with some large established vendor. You're being part of a project that involves people from all around the planet to make things better for everyone, that appeals to a lot of people. And we have a better roadmap. Once again, Microsoft is focusing on GitHub. We can use that to talk about, hey, did you know that like your investment into Azure DevOps, that like, even though you're going to get less out of that investment over time. So why not put your engineering resources to invest in a tool that's only going to get better and better, like GitLab, faster? So that is basically, it's not just what you get today, but it's what you get 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. All right, let's talk about Jenkins real quick. We're kind of running a little bit behind, so we'll dive right in. Jenkins, in one of the charts that we talked about earlier, it has a huge number of jobs out there. The reason why is because for a long period of time, Jenkins was the only tool out there. And so for almost 5 to 10 years, if you wanted to have CI, you used Jenkins. And so during that time, it just got more and more and more market share. In the last 3 years, what the industry has realized is that there's better tools that are available out there right now. And so if in general we can get into these accounts, explain our value proposition, why we're better, our differentiators, then we have a pretty high conversion rate. The other thing that I'd say about this is that as someone who's used Jenkins for about 5 years myself as an engineer, Jenkins is pretty easy to target because a lot of people don't like Jenkins. The only people who use Jenkins are people who aren't aware of all the other stuff that's out there right now in 2020. So this is a really great sign for us. One thing to talk about is the fact that it's open source and free. So we are competing with something that is not so when we're talking about competing with Jenkins, we're talking about something that people go out, they download it, and then they just install it on their own server, right? So it's not like a company. But sometimes it is a company. So what a lot of open source companies do is they'll have a free version and then they'll have an enterprise version. So the enterprise version will either do more, it will include support, it will have an established roadmap. And so like Red Hat, that's one of their primary business models. And so there's this company called CloudBees that offers an enterprise version of Jenkins. In actuality, we don't need to know so much about them. The long story short with them is that they're not super successful, simply because they don't add that much value in very few, like how often do y'all encounter CloudBees in your accounts?
Almost never.
No, never.
Exactly. So long story short is that like we don't need to be worried about them. We do need to be aware that they exist. So primarily we are competing with an open source and free tool. They have an estimated around 70% of the market share. And so this, having taken a look at this, I looked at a bunch of industry metrics, and the bottom line is around 70% of the accounts that we talk to will have Jenkins somewhere in their environment. Now that could be that we run all of our engineering CI on Jenkins, and it could be that there's one team that, since it's an open source tool, someone downloaded it and installed it, and they use it for some of their stuff. But around 2/3 of our accounts have Jenkins in their environment somewhere. It's an easy target, and let's talk about how they compete against us. So I interviewed a bunch of their salespeople, and what they told me is that they claim to be the leaders since they're the most mature. They talk about how we're too broad and immature, right? And the bottom line, though, is that having spoke with a bunch of people that used to sell CloudBees Jenkins, they actually told me that once GitLab got into their accounts, they usually abandoned the account just because it wasn't worth their time anymore. So we have a lot of success against CloudBees and Jenkins in general. But how do we win? So this is like the whole plugins thing. So let me sort of like dive into what plugins are. Let's imagine that you have some sort of application, right? It could be like your website or something else. But that website was designed by 200 different people. And so I made the home screen. Johan, you made the shopping cart. Daniel, you made like, the place that you get to see images. And 200 different people came up with this website. Now, the problem is that whenever there are 200 people that are involved in any project, people aren't really on the same page. And so now if you want to do anything that's major, like I want to upgrade the website, because 200 different people had different ideas, then it becomes really, really, really hard to do something like upgrading it, migrating it, changing it, just because there was never any consolidated vision, right? It was always just someone that was trying to make out their specific thing. So that's exactly what a plugin is. So like Jenkins is this open source project, and they made it extensible by having other people be able to write in their code that extends it. Now, all of a sudden, there's 200 different people, organizations that are written part of your application. And so now from an upgradability perspective, you install Jenkins, you configure it with all these plugins, and now if you upgrade it, then all of a sudden something like maybe 10, 20% of your plugins stop working. And so the problem is that most people who have Jenkins are aware of this problem and they don't actually upgrade Jenkins then because they wanted to continue working. And so Jenkins ends up becoming insecure. And then so people know that it's a problem, but there's no real good way of dealing with this just because of how the product was designed. Does that analogy make sense? All right, awesome. The other thing that I want to talk about with plugins is that people don't really make money off of plugins. So I'm just like an open source developer. I like Jenkins. I wanted to do this other thing. So I spend 8 hours of my time to develop a plugin, and then it's for my company. And all of a sudden, I just push it out, make it available for anyone else to use. And then let's just say that I retire, right? So here's another problem with plugins. I have 200 of these. Some of these are being updated, but since they're from the community, if I just made this plugin and then retired, then now there's no one that's putting out bug fixes, updates. It's basically obsolete at this point. And I have no idea of knowing which of these 200 plugins are actively being maintained, are safe, and which ones someone just made and then disappeared. And so like, given like 5 years time, 10 years time, the vast majority of your plugins, the people who originally made them don't care about them anymore. And now they're insecure and they may not even work, right? So that's another really big problem with plugins is that like, because they are from the open source community, there's no one that's saying, I've guaranteed that this works. It is going to work not only today, but tomorrow. And if I have all these 200 plugins within 2-year period of time, maybe 20% will be insecure, maybe 30% literally won't work if I upgrade Jenkins. And that's just because people are making them, then they're retiring, and then maybe no one ever like picks up like where the project was. So that's what we're talking about with plugins. One thing that I'd say about this is that like the engineers that are in charge of Jenkins themselves, they understand this is a problem. But if you talk to someone who isn't directly involved with like administrating or upgrading Jenkins, they don't really understand this problem. So we can't go in. I hear SDRs all the time go into calls and say like, tell me, do you have any problems with like Jenkins plugins? But they're talking to like a IT manager. The problem is that the IT manager doesn't know about Jenkins plugins and doesn't care. Instead, a better question to ask is, do you ever have any problems with Jenkins in general, where like you missed a deadline or like some sort of process broke because like it broke down at a critical time? Most businesses will say yes, and then you've uncovered pain, and then you can talk about that. But if you go if you go lead into a call and talking about Jenkins plugins with anyone except the people that are responsible and work on Jenkins, they won't know what you're talking about. That's just something to be aware of. So we another thing to talk about is that like Jenkins is an open source project. It's free. That being said, most organizations, they hire an engineer and pay him $150,000 a year to work on and maintain Jenkins full time. That is their job, is to make sure that Jenkins is running, just because Jenkins takes so much time. So if we point that out to our customers, then all of a sudden they realize, oh, it's not just free to paid. It does cost our organization money, right? How much money does this cost? Well, it's whatever the salary of the people who are using Jenkins is. GitLab is way more seamless. Your engineers will have to spend a lot less time operating, maintaining, upgrading the environment, and all of that is basically just like part of the picture that we're trying to paint. Last thing that I would like to talk about is Jenkins has no roadmap. Honestly, we can go into a lot of these accounts and basically say, did you know that the industry is migrating off of Jenkins? What are they migrating to? Well, there's a lot of other tools out there and they're much better. I'm happy to tell you about like GitLab and our story and like why. In the next 3 to 5 years, Jenkins market share is going to substantially decrease. This is our market to win. How often do y'all talk about Jira in your accounts? Is it pretty common?
Yeah, all the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
Okay. I also want to respect your schedules. I'm going to try to finish things up in the next couple of minutes, but if we go 1 or 2 minutes over 10:20, is that all right?
It's fine, yeah.
Yeah, good one.
All right, awesome. So it's a similar story with Jira in the sense that they were the only tool out there for a really long time, and so they just gobbled up markets share. They have over 50% of the market for project management. What I mean by project management is like tickets, roadmaps, milestones, all that agile planning stuff. So particularly, they had first movers advantage. They've been in existence since 2002, and they're really, really, really big. So their company has been astronomically successful. This is their stock price. Their stock price in the last 3 years has literally gone up almost like 5x or something like that. And in terms of industry validation, they're ranked really, really highly. The problem is that as someone who's used Jira, it does do a lot of really great things, but it takes a lot of time to get there. It's really hard to install and configure. So that's like something to be aware of with Jira. Here's the market share for different agile management tools. And as you can see, Jira comes in at 53% market share. And if we take a look at Google Docs is only at 14%. So literally we're talking about a really dominant player. So competitive history, we know this, our motion is to integrate with Jira. The reason why is because if I've used Jira for 5 years, 10 years, which many of our large customers have, then they have a lot of data on Jira, and it's not so easy to just migrate all of that stuff onto another platform and teach everyone that new platform. So that's why we've invested in making a first-class integration with Jira, making it very easy to use the two tools together. And one of the new things that has started happening is that Jira announced a couple of weeks ago that they are discontinuing support for all of their on-prem versions. So this is Bitbucket, this is Jira, this is all of their on-prem tools. They are discontinuing in 2024. So they have 4 years to migrate off onto either another on-prem solution are onto a SaaS-based solution. So since GitLab is really, really, really good at on-prem deployment, this is now our like market to win, is our customers that they need to have an on-prem solution. It could be GitLab. So
Funny you said that. I actually had a sales opportunity the other day exactly for that reason. It was like a contact request saying that they need to move off of Jira because they need something on premise.
yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I want to be true to my promise. It's now 2020. There is going to be a Google Doc that goes out. This is how you get course credit. So be sure to fill it out in the next 10 days. Get it back to me. That's how you get credit for the class. But is there anything else that I could help to clarify while we have some time together, or we can just wrap up this session?
A couple of quick questions. Johan, I don't know if you needed to drop off, whether you wanted to ask your question and go, or.
I got 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So my first question, before I can't remember what point that sparked it, but I think it was when you was talking about one of our differentiators being security. And I was just saying, I don't know whether it's just an SMB problem, but kind of security and GitLab sort of locked behind the paywall of Ultimate/Gold of $99 per user per month, which is that actually expensive in the industry and security, or is that just an SMB problem of startups not being able to afford that type of pricing?
That's a really great question. Most startups, they are spending all of their effort into just getting something that works, and they don't even really care about security. So literally, they're working on like coming up with a viable version of their product that they can then pitch to investors and get investor money. And then after they have that initial round of funding, then they're spending all of their effort into basically becoming like cash break even. So their focus isn't so much on security. Their focus is on like getting more business and getting a product that actually will sell. So in terms of like the amount of money that they do have that amount of money to spend out on our highest tier. It's just that security in general isn't an emphasis for a lot of these people simply because they may not know if they are going to exist in like 1 to 2 years, right? And so they don't really care so much about some security exploit coming out. What they want is to make sure that their product actually works, so that they can sell it, so that they can prove to investors to give them more money.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So it might be a SMB specific thing. And that maybe
I am curious in regards to pricing though. Like, I mean, Sneak, I guess, would be a similar competitor in regards to GitLab security offerings. Is that correct?
I haven't heard of
How would you
that
say
particular one.
Or which one would you say is the biggest competitors in regards to just security for GitLab?
Well, Sneak is open source, and they've also got like a lot of free functionality as well. So I'm not sure if that would be one of them. But do you know pricing wise, Chris, whether $99 per user per month for like a security solution is that expensive, or is that average, or?
Yeah, that's a real like so. The only companies that really care about security are companies with a lot of money. So if you're some small company and you have a security exploit, then you are so small that the amount of like media damage to that isn't that much, just because like people don't know about you in general. But if there were ever a security problem with something like Facebook or Twitter, and then all the personal data got leaked, then all of a sudden that's like a $20 billion like loss of like revenue for those companies. So those companies really care about security, and all of the security vendors know that their primary customer segment is enterprise, and so they charge accordingly. They know that they're going after Facebook, Google, Microsoft. These are companies with huge budgets. They know that their cash value that they're willing to spend for security is large, and therefore that's why they're priced the way that they are. My personal take is that GitLab's security is reasonably priced. It's just that it's for like commercial businesses and not generally like SMB, just because SMB isn't as focused on security. They just want to get something that works.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah, because a lot of the time, if we talk about like GitLab vision and talking about like our value proposition or whatever, I try and talk about, putting security left and all that kind of thing. And they're like, oh, that's so interesting. And they're like, oh, so is that available on bronze or silver? And I'm like, oh, well, it's actually in the gold tier. Oh, right, what's that priced at? $99 per user per month. Oh, okay, no, sorry. This and it's a complete turn off, and like the whole conversation is like ruined.
Maybe this would be helpful, but when I worked for startup, we would never, I think we talked about security once. Like out of all the time that we're brainstorming, talking about engineering stuff, 99% of it was how to get something to work. Less than 1% of it was about like whether or not we're doing things in a secure manner.
Yeah. So your advice would be just to leave that out of the conversation in SMB then?
I think that it's worth like asking about, but it's not something that I'd push really heavily on, just knowing that it's not a priority for them. Their priority is to get something that works.
Yeah, no, cool. Appreciate it. Second last question was GitLab weaknesses. Like, what are they in your opinion, and what are we doing about them?
Yeah. The biggest weakness for GitLab, in my opinion, is because we have monthly releases and we have this MVC approach that we tend to push out stuff that isn't really great. So what most companies do is they'll only have like a release every 4 to 6 months, and then they want to make those releases great because they understand that like the latest version of their product represents like what people think about the company, right? What GitLab does is because we have an MVC approach, sometimes our features like are very, very, very minimal in the sense that they almost do nothing. And when a customer sees that, they're just sort of like, this is a joke. I don't understand why we do this, because like they don't understand that we do take this MVC approach. So when it's not a weakness necessarily for us, it's a trade-off. The trade-off is that with the MVC approach, you're going to develop things faster. The trade-off is that sometimes you don't make a good first impression with other companies that are using your product because some of the stuff that we're introducing to these customer environments, they don't look great yet.
Yeah. Okay.
Chris, in regards to releasing monthly, I mean, where do you said, of course, that GitHub is around a year behind us. What's your estimate on, let's say, exactly how far they are behind us month-wise, and when do you think they'll catch up? I mean, I think it's a matter of course, I know our goal is to stay in front, but I think at some point, being realistic, they will catch up and probably overtake at some point.
Yeah, so let me sort of talk about that because obviously we have stock in this company, right? It's important to understand just sort of like where that's going to intersect. I estimate that it's 1 year if we're not moving forward too. So if GitLab stopped improving our product and they had 1 year to catch up, it'd probably take them about 1 year to implement a large chunk of the stuff that we have now. But it's different because we're not just sitting still. We're also improving our product all the time. And one of the advantages that we have over them is that the open source community directly contributes to GitLab versus GitHub is all like closed source. So they don't have the ability to do that. The other thing that I think that they're going to have problems with is just the fact that GitHub Actions was designed the way that it was, that whenever you sort of like architect, so like it's almost like a bad foundation for a house. If you have a bad foundation for a house and you build this beautiful house on top of it, given a long enough period of time, you're going to basically have to tear down the house and re-architect everything, regardless of whatever amazing stuff that you put in. You can delay it by putting in a lot of like beams and poles and like doing things to fix it. But if it has a bad foundation, that's a structural problem. From an architecture point of view, GitHub Actions, the good thing about it is that they increased its functionality like 10, 20, 30, 50 fold very quickly. But from an architectural point of view, just because they designed it the way that they did, they're always going to run into the problems of, if we're an enterprise, I do not have time and want to investigate your platform plus your 19 integrations, make sure that everything works together, make sure that everything passes my security team, because your tool is going to be looking at my code, which is my most valuable asset for a lot of these companies, right? So like, it's just like that, just because of how they chose that to work, there's always going to be problems with that I don't think that they can overcome, because they're not like technological problems. It's just like how they designed it is not necessarily the best. I think that we will have significant advantages over them in terms of product for a long time.
Thanks, Chris. Good answer. I have to drop to the next call, but I'm not sure. Maybe do you see my last question there, Chris? Maybe you can do that async or maybe an email. I'm just curious about that. I've had that objection a few times, but I need to drop to a call now. 1 minute.
Okay, I'll definitely answer this async. Thank you all for your time. I'll send it out by email.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Take care. Bye, everyone. Bye, Daniel.